Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Fizz, and let's learn some physiology. Alright, we're back. Today we're going to be discussing a lot of topics under the umbrella of the nervous system. So let's get right into it. As you can see here, we have a flow chart of the entirety of the nervous system within our bodies. Within the nervous system, you have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, that is composed of our brain and our spinal cord that connects to our brain. Outside of the spinal cord, we have the peripheral nervous system, which involves both the autonomic and the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system covers the sympathetic pathway and the parasympathetic pathway. The somatic nervous system involves senses and motion. We're going to be talking about one specific area, and that is the peripheral nervous system. And under that umbrella of the peripheral nervous system, we'll be talking about the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is involuntary, involves involuntary actions that we do not control or have to think about, like breathing or heart rate or secretion of sweat. Somatic nervous system has to deal with our movements, whether it be our touch or our movements of our skeletal muscles. Let's move on. Alright, so specifically we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, which is broken down into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. Within the autonomic nervous system, we have two categories, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Within the somatic nervous system, we just have sensory and motor. So here this chart describes where the nerves come from, or how many neurons are located within the entire strand, where they're located, what neurotransmitters are used, and receptors that receive those signals. Within the sympathetic nervous system, our spinal cord, T1 through L1 or L2 depending, our sympathetic nervous system exits through the vertebrae T1 through L1 or L2 depending. Within that pathway, you have two different types of neurons, pre- and post-ganglionic. We'll get into that a little later. Most of these nerves innervate things above the diaphragm, as well as the adrenal gland, as well as the adrenal gland and the splanchnic nerve. Most of what we'll deal with is above the diaphragm when it comes to the sympathetic nervous system. Know that there is something called dual innervation. Dual innervation is the understanding that both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system work in junction with each other with most of the organs in the body. The neurotransmitters that are used within the sympathetic division are epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are also called catecholamines. Dopamine is another catecholamine as well. Acetylcholine is also used, and specifically, it's what triggers the receptors in the adrenal glands. Within the sympathetic nervous system, we have both adrenergic receptors and muscarinic receptors, as well as nicotinic receptors. We're going to go through each of those in just a bit. But specifically within the sympathetic nervous system, we have A1, B1, M-odd, and B2. Each of these do different things within the sympathetic nervous system, and we'll cover that in a bit. The nicotinic receptors cover the junctions between our skeletal muscles as well as our pre- and post-ganglionic synapses. The sympathetic nervous system is generally referred to as our fight or flight response system. It's the system that helps us when, for example, we're being chased by a bear. We'll cover more what happens in the nervous system in a bit. The parasympathetic nervous system, or also called the rest and digest system, is a system in use when we're relaxed on the couch, eating ice cream, and watching some TV. Most of the parasympathetic nervous system originates from the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10. In this, just like the sympathetic nervous system, we have a post and pre-ganglionic neuron. Most of the examples that we'll deal with the parasympathetic nervous system lies below the diaphragm. Whatever the vagus nerve innervates as well is also affected. The main neurotransmitter within the parasympathetic system, the rest and digest system, is acetylcholine, or ACH abbreviated. The receptors found inside of the parasympathetic nervous system are, for the most part, muscarinic receptors. We also have nicotinic that deals with the translation between pre- and post-ganglionic synapses. Finally, for the somatic nervous system, most of it comes from the spinal cord. It deals with sensory as well as motor, and they're all bunched into what's called the spinal nerve, which tends to deal with the outside of our body, sensory in the skin. You'll always find the somatic nervous system outside of the cavities of the body, thoracic, abdominal. This system also uses acetylcholine as its main neurotransmitter, although there are others, and it relies on somatosensory receptors, as well as nicotinic receptors. Alrighty, as previously mentioned, we have something that are called receptors, which receive neurotransmitters in the body. Again, once we map all this out, this will make a little bit more sense. These receptors rely on something called G proteins, so they are called G protein coupled receptors. We'll go through each of these and describe what they do and how they affect the body. Our first G protein coupled receptor group is called the muscarinic odd receptor group. This group is excitatory and affects the eyes, the lungs, and the sweat glands. It increases IP3 and therefore increases the amount of calcium within the cell. How does this affect the body? Well, M1, 3, and 5 have the ability to cause meiosis or pupillary constriction, as well as bronchoconstriction, which is the constriction of our bronchioles in our lungs, causing us to not have to breathe as much. It also helps with sweating. We'll go into each of these in just a little bit. Muscarinic 2 and 4 are inhibitory receptors, and when they are stimulated, they decrease CAMP, which is a messenger molecule, which therefore decreases heart rate. Alpha-1 receptors are excitatory. They deal with the eyes and the blood vessels. They increase IP3, and they cause something called mydriasis, which is the dilation of our pupils. They also cause for vasoconstriction. If we can remember, looking at the chart, alpha-1 receptors are adrenergic, and they are part of the sympathetic nervous system, or the flight or fight response. So you can imagine that we want to be able to see what's going on around us when we're trying to run away from a bear, so our eyes will dilate, as well as blood will have to move to different parts of the body super fast, and so our blood vessels will constrict, pushing that blood through and increasing blood pressure and heart rate. Another adrenergic receptor is alpha-2. It's inhibitory and decreases CAMP. Beta-1 and beta-3 are adrenergic receptors. Beta-1 deals with heart rate, and beta-3 deals with fat and adipose tissue. They are excitatory, and specifically in the heart, beta-1 receptors deal with the heart, AV, and SA node, the SA node being our pacemaker. They increase CAMP, which tells the heart rate to increase as well. Beta-2 involve our lungs. They increase CAMP and cause bronchodilation. You'll note up here, it says rule. Odds are excitatory and evens are inhibitory, all except beta-2. This is a good rule to keep in mind. They apply both to muscarinic and adrenergic receptors, and beta-2 is the only one that's you can see I messed up here actually. Beta-2 is the only one that's actually excitatory. So it'll increase CAMP and cause bronchodilation, which, when we're trying to run away from a bear, our lungs are going to want to let in as much air as possible in order to breathe heavier and get farther. Alright, let's move on. Alright, so we've mentioned nicotinic receptors before. Let's talk about them real quick. So nicotinic receptors are not G protein coupled receptors. They are different type of receptors that are in our skeletal muscles as well as our pre to post ganglionic nerves. We'll draw them, we'll show you them, don't worry about it. But just know, have this information in your mind, that nicotinic receptors involve N1, which is skeletal muscles, and N2, which relates to pre and post ganglionic synapses. One of the main functions of these is that they increase permeability of sodium and calcium. Alrighty, now on to the promised drawings of all of these systems. So we'll draw every pathway involved in the sympathetic nervous system, as well as the pathway involved in this parasympathetic nervous system. So right here, we have our stereotypical sympathetic nervous system pathway. Important points to remember is that it comes off of the dorsal root in the spinal cord, synapses in the sympathetic chain ganglia, and then through an unmyelinated route, which is usually longer than the first, it will stimulate the heart and the lungs. Usually with the sympathetic nervous system, we have a shorter preganglionic neuron, and we have a longer postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron is cholinergic, which means that it releases acetylcholine. That acetylcholine interacts with N2, which is what our pre to post ganglionic receptors, through the synaptic cleft. This is excitatory and sends a signal through an adrenergic pathway, which is unmyelinated, releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are catecholamines. They reach different targets, and these targets for this specific pathway are the cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, and different glands in our body. The receptors that are involved with the sympathetic pathways are A1, A2, B1, B2, and B3, the adrenergic receptors. Remember, with the heart, B1 is involved with increasing heart rate, and that's about it. Remember with the heart that B1 is one of the most important receptors for increasing heart rate. Alright, talking about the adrenal medulla pathway, this is also involved in the sympathetic nervous system. It starts in the dorsal root. It starts in the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, exits the spine, goes around the sympathetic chain ganglia, and synapses in the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is right above the kidney. On a smaller scale, this is kind of a good representation of it. Myelinated the entire way, this cholinergic nerve releases acetylcholine here. That's why it's called cholinergic, to the N2 receptors on the adrenal gland. From there, the adrenal gland releases both norepinephrine and epinephrine, or otherwise known as catecholamines, into the bloodstream, and that allows for different reactions to occur, thus improving our flight or fight response. Also important to note that the adrenal medulla pathway passes through the collateral ganglia, but it does not synapse there. Alright, the last pathway we'll talk about in the sympathetic nervous system is the pathway that triggers our sweat glands. We'll see here that it synapses in the sympathetic chain ganglia and then goes to our sweat glands. Muscarinic receptors 1, 3, and 5 are responsible for the activation of our sweat glands. We can see here that myelinated is pretty short. It is cholinergic, releases acetylcholine. We'll see here that this preganglionic neuron is cholinergic, releases acetylcholine in the sympathetic chain ganglia, and then that synapse triggers more cholinergic behavior and releases acetylcholine onto these receptors. Alright, our second to last system that we're going to talk about is the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system synapses outside of the spinal cord and the synapses outside of the sympathetic chain ganglia, and it synapses in something called the terminal ganglia. This system, remember, is rest and digest. It has a short postsynaptic neuron and a really long presynaptic neuron. It releases acetylcholine in the terminal ganglia, as well as releases acetylcholine to its target receptors. The target receptors for our parasympathetic nervous system are the muscarinic receptors. Now, here's an important point. Note that the PNS, or the parasympathetic nervous system, does not affect blood vessels or sweat glands. Only the sympathetic nervous system will. But understand, too, that anything that will trigger muscarinic receptors will also trigger sweat glands. So, though not directly related to increased sweating, you could release a neurotransmitter that affects M1 receptors, which not only improves the function of our GI tract, but also can trigger increased sweat. Alrighty, last pathway we'll talk about is the somatic pathway, which super briefly covers the sensory and the motor neurons. The sensory neurons leaving the dorsal root, and we'll go through the dorsal root ganglia. Our motor neurons will go to the skeletal muscle and allow for us to move. Alrighty, so 3 important things that we need to understand before we end this video are MAOs, organophosphates, and atropine. MAOs, or monoamino oxidases, or MAOs, are drugs that will decrease the amount of catecholamines in our system. So if we decrease catecholamines, like norepinephrine, our sympathetic nervous system will decrease in activity, thus causing our rest and digest to kick in. The next drug we'll talk about is atropine. Atropine is a muscarinic antagonist. That means that any neurotransmitters won't be able to interact with muscarinic. Therefore, our parasympathetic nervous system won't work as much, and the sympathetic nervous system will work more. The last thing we want to talk about is organophosphates. Organophosphates involve the blocking of acetylcholine esterase. Acetylcholine esterase is super important because that will allow for the breakdown of acetylcholine and allow the system to restart. But if we get rid of acetylcholine esterase, acetylcholine will just run wild and continue to synapse. Thus, our parasympathetic nervous system, which involves a lot of acetylcholine, will kick in and we won't be able to stop it.